Hi, class. Today we are talking about the George W. Bush administration. So, yeah, we're up to that point in the textbook already. It's kind of interesting to get that far in the textbook and interesting to cover this amount of material about modern presidents or more modern presidents. So, George W. Bush was president. He was elected in 2000. But as we mentioned with many of the presidents, presidents are elected in even years, but they are inaugurated in odd years. So the presidents are elected in November of an even year, and then they're inaugurated in January of the year afterwards. So if the election would be in 2020, November of 2020, the inauguration would happen in January of 2021. So the president that's elected in November of the even year doesn't start serving until the January of the odd year. So President George W. Bush was elected in the year 2000. And the election of George W. Bush was a contested election. So George W. Bush ran against Al Gore. And there was a very tight race. It was very tight. Like the election results were very close, particularly in the Electoral College. Every president needs 270 votes to win. So the winning president needs 270 electoral votes. And generally, what happens with electoral votes is the electoral votes in a state that, so like let's say Pennsylvania, if the majority of voters in Pennsylvania vote for George W. Bush, then George W. Bush wins all of the electors for the state of Pennsylvania. So instead of splitting it and saying, well, if George W. Bush won 20 electors out of the 20 odd number in Pennsylvania, then he gets 20 based on this percentage that he won. Or if it's 51%, he gets 51% of the electors, 49% goes to the other guy. It doesn't usually work that way. Most states it's set up that, well, it doesn't work that way, period, in any state. But some states have some weird results. We'll just say that. And there is such a thing we'll talk about as faithless electors, where even though the state votes for, we'll say, George W. Bush, an elector may cast their vote for the other guy. And they'll be a faithless elector and they won't go with the majority of the people. But what was going on in the 2000 election with George W. Bush? So Florida was the most hotly contested state because the candidate that won the state of Florida between George W. Bush and Al Gore, whoever won the state of Florida won the presidential election for the year 2000. And it was very, very, very close. By very close, I mean a few hundred votes close. All right, that close. A few hundred votes as to who won the state of Florida and therefore the presidency. So usually when a vote is that close, a candidate will call for a recount. So Al Gore asked for a recount, and the recount showed that George W. Bush was the winner of Florida. But Al Gore didn't like that result, and he didn't like how close it was. I mean, it was really close, a few hundred. So he asked actually for another recount. And the Supreme Court ruled that Al Gore could have another recount, but it had to be done by the day of the ruling, by the end of that day. So basically, like, no second recounts. It was their nice way of saying no. But because of that, George W. Bush won the presidential election of 2000. But there were a lot of accusations on both sides of voter fraud. I mean, some people said George W. Bush stole the election, and a lot of Republicans pointed out that there seemed to be voter fraud on the side of the Democrats in the recount. So there were accusations on both sides of voter fraud, and a lot of America was just generally unhappy with how the election of 2000 was conducted. And it actually changed the way we vote because by 2000, still, a lot of voting was done by a punch card. It was actually a piece of paper, and you would poke a hole in the piece of paper with a plunger. It was like a little pin, and you would poke a hole, and it would punch out something. It was a little rectangular square. It was probably about an eighth of an, well, actually about a 16th of an inch by an eighth of an inch. It was really small, and it was called a chad. And in the state of Florida, there were a lot of ballots, or at least enough to cause controversy, where if that chad, that little piece of paper, was not all the way detached from the ballot, it didn't count. It was called a hanging chad. And if it wasn't pushed with enough force to poke the Chad out, then it was called a dimpled Chad. And none of those votes were able to be counted. And because of all the controversy around that, America went largely to computer-based voting. I mean, I know you're used to that now, seeing on TV and in the news. I know you're not used to voting yet, but you're used to seeing, when you see voting, you see polling, you see a computer. Well, the reason why we use computers to vote is largely because of the 2000 election, where people had issues in Florida with properly posting their ballots. They just had trouble punching the pieces of the ballot off. So it changed the way we vote, which is kind of a big deal. Also, when George W. Bush is elected, there's a lot of tension between the Republicans and the Democrats, partially over the idea of how the election was conducted. And you can look back in history and see things like that. I mean, if you look at the corrupt bargain in 1824, that would be an example of a lot of controversy around election. Compromise of 1877, right? That would be another example where there's so much voter fraud that Congress has to appoint a special committee to pick the president. So there are examples throughout history where there are contested elections and there are bad feelings on both sides. And this is another example, the election of 2000. Well, George W. Bush is inaugurated and he takes office in 2001. And knowing your history like you do, it's not very long into his presidential administration until he has his biggest challenge, which is 9/11. September 11th, 2001 happens. It's not even a full year into his first term as president, and George W. Bush has to deal with a major catastrophe. I mean, it's just a tragedy where thousands of people are killed by an act of terrorism on American soil. And it just caused a lot of unrest, not in the sense of like protesting, although, you know, some people were upset about a lot of people were upset about what happened, but more so unrest, like as unease. America was really uneasy about being able to be attacked, and we wanted the government to do something. We wanted to see a strong leader step up, and George W. Bush did. And we declared the war on terror, global war on terror, which we talked about. We talked about last week the Iraq War, the Afghan War, and the global war on terror, which the Iraq War and Afghan War are parts of. So that was one of George W. Bush's major challenges. Some other things that happened during the George W. Bush administration, and I keep saying George W. Bush because there are two George Bushes that were presidents. There's George H.W. Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, who was president in the 1990s, and his son George Walker Bush, who we're talking about now, was president elected in 2000. And it's the second set of father-son presidents ever in American history. The first is John Adams and John Quincy Adams, and the second is George Herbert Walker Bush and George W. Bush. Anyway, so also things that occurred under the George W. Bush administration would be tax cuts, tax breaks. So George W. Bush, he offered tax breaks. He cut the tax rates on people. So the American tax rate for income taxes went from the highest bracket, dropped about 5%. So it was like 39.5% to about 34%. And he gave tax rate cuts to a lot of Americans. And that really helped the economy, which was struggling after 9/11 because the World Trade Center was hit. And it's called the World Trade Center for a reason, because it was a major world trade hub. And that really crippled the American economy for a little bit. I mean, it caused a lot of tension as far as trade is concerned, just a lag in trade. The stock market dropped, but the economy recovered, and it did very well under George W. Bush for quite a while. So we see George W. Bush with 9/11, global war on terror, Iraq War, Afghan War, tax cuts, and then one of the other major things, aside from, you know, obviously the 2004 election, which George W. Bush wins, one of the other major things that George W. Bush is known for is being the president under the Great Recession. It's sometimes referred to as the Great Recession. It's also the housing crisis, where in 2007, late 2007, early 2008, the housing market in America just collapses. And it was a major stock market crash for a while. Like not long term, but very short term, the stock market dropped about 50% it lost about 50%. That's half of its value. Now, it did come back, but it's a huge drop in the stock market. I mean, look at what happened recently. The stock market didn't drop 50%, but in March, so before all these lockdowns started happening under President Trump, the stock market was at 29,000 and change. It was creeping to 30,000 points. And at its lowest, it got down into the 18s, which is not quite 50%. It's still a huge drop. And then it came back up to the 24s, 23s, 24s, where we're at now. But that's still a pretty big drop, but not as big as the housing crisis of 2007, 2008. So the stock market took a big dip, and it took a long time for the housing market to recover. And just a very brief summary of what happened. Loans were offered at what's called subprime. Subprime loans were offered to people who really shouldn't have qualified for a loan at that value or at that interest rate because they were either high risk of default or they were borrowing more than they were able to pay back. These loans were issued very easily, and there wasn't a lot of checking into whether or not this person would be able to repay the loan. And a lot of people started defaulting on their loans, and it just caused a snowball effect and crashed the financial markets because people actually buy, like large banks and other investors buy loan packages, and they bought these loan packages thinking they were worth a lot, and they actually weren't because a lot of people weren't paying them back. To put it into perspective, I was listening to a podcast with a financial analyst who actually was advising a major, major banking firm, like think one of the biggest names in banking. And he was trying to explain to them how much money they were losing in this housing crisis. Like he was on the front end, they were predicting it, it was just starting to happen. And he said that essentially in the next year, they were going to lose more money than they had made in the past decade. Think about that. That is a huge financial loss. And that wasn't just one banking firm, that was a lot of banking firms. And it trickled down into the employment sector as well. It just caused a recession, a slowdown in the economy. So George W. Bush was president when that happened, and he was largely blamed for the recession. Any president is blamed for something that happens. He didn't make the policy that caused it. Congress had made some policies or pushed for policies that had caused it. But every president that's presiding, every leader takes the blame for bad things that happen under their administration. So George W. Bush was, the bad guy in that. And also, he was perceived as that. I'm not saying it was his fault. I'm not saying it wasn't. I'm just saying that that's how it was perceived. Also, he tried to offer a lot of bailouts, like multi-$100 billion bailouts to big companies to prop up the economy, and the Fed cut interest rates dramatically. But none of that really had an immediate impact on stopping the housing crisis. And he took some criticism for his handling of the housing crisis, especially because his administration and a lot of people that were like him particularly, and people that were part of his administration were making claims as this was going on that it wasn't really that big of a deal, and it wasn't really a major financial crisis, and the economy's doing great. And then economy crashes, and everyone's like, weren't you just saying the economy was doing great? So successes of the Bush administration would be response to 9/11, the economy under tax cuts, like the tax cuts stimulating the economy, and who doesn't like tax cuts, right? So response to 9/11, tax cuts. Some people would say global war on terror, some wouldn't. And things that were not all that awesome during the Bush administration would be the housing crisis, 2007, 2008 housing crisis. And there are others that people might say were, not great parts of the Bush administration. Every president has their ups and downs. But the housing crisis was enough to really tarnish the reputation of George W. Bush as a president. But that's George W. Bush for today. He was, just again recapping, second father-son pair president, elected in 2000, majorly contested election, served 2 terms. All right, if you have any questions, feel free to email me. Otherwise, I hope you all have a great day.